Thank you for the invitation. Yes, I'm like many of you in this room. I was a student in 1968 at the Warsaw University, just the first year of my studies. But unlike most of you, with maybe 2 or 3 exceptions, I did not emigrate. And I have some, of course, things to say about what was happening then, at that time, and then perhaps a bit about some later years, which, if it's of interest. Okay, so I would say that my experience of 1968, of course it means 67, 68, 69, more or less, but we always say that March 1968, this is the symbol of that period, is involvement, exaltation, fear, and, later consequences of all those things. By involvement, I mean political involvement among students or my peers. So, for example, I was in a sort of clandestine study group organized by older students, but some of us younger ones were admitted. We were reading literature that was produced, in Cultura in Paris by the Polish émigré publishing house, and discussing political things. And this happened already at the very beginning, when I began in 1967. And so those meetings were very important to me. And of course, some of those students were connected to those leaders whose names became well known, and they were mentioned by Professor Stola and some other before, so I won't do that. And then when the so-called events, that is the student revolt, and especially the reaction to the police repressions and the brutality of the police. By the way, the brutality was, of course, there. The police and those workers or pseudo-workers or those members of the military groups, paramilitary groups that were called to suppress the student revolt, the student protests. So they provoked all the other protests. So if not for that, probably there wouldn't have been so much happening. But let me just say that compared to what the police did to students in Paris, it was not that brutal. The difference was that in Paris, there was no totalitarian regime where the same government, the same, power elite controls the police and the universities and the jobs and everything, and the passports you can get or be denied or not be granted. So the fear that started at that time and was rising for some time was completely indifferent and much stronger than it could have possibly been in Paris, even though in Paris, in some other places of the world, the police as such was probably more brutal and in some ways. But that's just an important, I think, element to see the international context of the March 68 event in Poland. We did have that sort of feeling, although of course we didn't know much, and I was very young, so I was really not really competent to know what was happening in Berkeley, Paris, etc. Still, there was a feeling that there is some connection, that the youth, those born after the war, yes, they're now becoming adult, that should be place for us, there should be more freedom, and we should be more. The regimes should be more liberal. So this sort of feeling did exist at that time, I would say, even though it maybe was naive to compare Poland with the other countries. Certainly there was much easier and more proper to compare Poland with Czechoslovakia, yes, where things were happening at the time already. The Prague Spring was developing and was crushed soon, a few months later, after in August '68. Which was another very important and very formative experience for all those who had been involved in March events. Now, I said So involvement is one thing. Exaltation, because it was a feeling, a good feeling, of doing something important, which was related to the ideals which formally existed in public life and truly existed in, say, my family. That is, that there should be justice and more freedom and for people, and this socialism with human face, as they called it in Prague. This was certainly expressing what I and some other active students were thinking. Probably we were in a small minority, because others, normal, regular students, probably wouldn't think about socialism as something good. At the same time, nobody really dared, or nobody thought about saying that socialism is bad, let's replace it with capitalism. This was not done, and this was not really discussed. Maybe there were some people who were thinking that, but it was never expressed. Maybe because it would be going too far, but maybe because really people didn't feel that this was the right way to go. Anyway, the repressions and then made us all feel that the government and the system, that the communist system was bad, and this mistrust and it was rising. And the shock was by the police interventions, and the repressions was very strong. And of course for me, but not just for me, anti-Semitism that surfaced was really a shock. That is, to me, until then, Jewishness was not important. I was not given a Jewish education, I was not given a Jewish identity, even though in 1962, I guess, we visited Israel with my mother, whose father was living in Haifa, but I knew so little. That's something that perhaps is hard to believe for many, that I knew so little about what Jewishness meant that it didn't really affect me. Because in order to absorb something, to have it seen as something important to you, you need some basic elementary knowledge, which I didn't have at the time. But everybody was saying, both Professor Stolla and Professor Kaliner, that students were suffering as students and not as Jews. This is true, but not quite. For example, there was this famous protest against the suppression of this Jad drama, the 30th of January. I wasn't there, but my close friend was there, and he was telling me that when they were then, after the demonstration, they were arrested, he was approached by two of those policemen, or maybe plainclothes policemen, and they looked at him and said, this guy doesn't look Zionist. So they clearly wanted to find people who looked Jewish in order to have this thesis which they had, that the Jews were behind everything, arrested and exposed. And this shows that even at that stage, before March, this did exist in some ways. Now, the fear, as I said, was really overwhelming. Also in my family, I remember, for example, when we had some of those books that were seen as illegal by the government, and my parents, or my mother really, decided that we should get rid of them. How? You have some books. How to get rid of books? To put them somewhere, somebody would see, and this would be even worse. So what could we do? My mother tried to burn books in the bathtub, which was not so easy. I can tell you, it's not so easy to burn a lot of books if you don't want to have a great, fire. Anyway, the consequences for me were very clear. First of all, emigration of friends. My girlfriend emigrated. My best colleague, my best friend emigrated. And of course, we did decide emigration in my family. My mother was rather in favor, my father was rather against, and finally, the decision was not to emigrate, and a few months later, the issues stopped being really a hot issue. And I think it's always the case, I know that most immigrants think that what they did was the only way to go, but this is never true, almost never true, I would say. You may always there are some pros and some contrasts, and you balance them, and what the result is depends on your personal situation. Had I been expelled from the university, I wanted to study mathematics. This was the most important thing for me at that time. So had I been expelled, I certainly would have emigrated. I mean, no doubt about it. But I was not, and so I could continue, and then it went on. I was involved in many ways then, but that's something else. But 1968, August, the invasion of Czechoslovakia was important. We even tried to do something. Some people who had been involved in the march activities were protesting, but very few were protesting the Polish participation in the invasion of Czechoslovakia and crushing the Prague Spring. And so that is important because when we think that there were so few protests against anti-Semitism in March in '68, we may sometimes too easily conclude that the protests were not there because people didn't want to protest. That's not so simple. I don't think so many Poles were happy seeing, the Polish invasion, Polish army invading Czechoslovakia, but very few protested. So in that system, protesting was not possible. I'm not saying there was no anti-Semitism or people wanted to protest so much. I don't have any evidence for that. By the way, when I was working on the core exhibition, on the post-war section of the core exhibition in Polin Museum, we tried to show not just anti-Semitism, because of course it's shown in a very strong way with the Gomulka speech mentioned by Professor Karliner a few minutes ago, included, etc. But I also tried to find some material, that is some material from 1968, written, not recollections, but something from that time, because this was our principle that we use only material from that time rather than later descriptions of it, of pro-Jewish, so to say, or anti-Semitic activities, and it was very hard to. Interestingly enough, this hasn't been mentioned today yet, I think, there were in the student resolutions in Warsaw and in many other places, anti-Semitism was very often mentioned and something that we are against. I mean, we are against anti-Semitism, but the next line was, and we are against Zionism. So somehow there was so much confusion, and Zionism was in the propaganda, in the official press of that time, was something like, the most devilish, the most sinister, evil thing that you can imagine. So nobody would dare to say to be pro-Zionist, and students generally accepted. I must say I didn't feel it was so bad, although I wouldn't accept that, but I didn't feel it was so bad that Zionism was also somehow seen as a negative point of reference, which was of course something the Jewish communists had been doing all their lives. And so those who were coming from communist families and those Jewish students who were leaders of the movement were not all, but usually coming from communist families, had that anti-Zionist bias from home, so to say. So it's not so, okay. Now, so these things were happening. Then I did make my PhD, but I couldn't work neither at Warsaw University nor in Jagiellonia University, although they wanted me there. But I could work. It was in the early 70s already in the Warsaw, Białystok branch of the Warsaw University, in Białystok. So there were also later some consequences for me, but not of '68 or of my Jewishness really, but of my political involvement that began in 1968. I was among the most active opponents of the unification of youth movements in 1972. Something of no importance for you, but it was important for me then. Of course, now it's old history. Now, so these are the consequences, plus, of course, there is this huge and important consequence, namely, this year and the March event as such made me began my Jewish search, made me realize that Jewishness was important, unlike what my parents had been thinking all the time and somehow transmitting the feeling to me that Jewishness was something of the past, completely irrelevant at that time, and so that had nothing to do with us except for the, this unimportant point of the past, yes. And so this, of course, I understood that this was not true, that being Jewish meant that I could suffer because of that. And soon I, together with some others who were feeling similarly, we began to try to explore what Jewishness meant, to have something, to see, have, and incorporate in our lives something more than just fear of repression, of anti-Semitism. This led me to a very full and comprehensive Jewish involvement, including I'm Shomer Shabbat, and I've been for many years. So this was very important, but this, of course, took time. It was not something that happened overnight, because this was this special, environment, a group of people, my parents belonged to, that their religion was communism, and 68 was basically the end of it. I mean, it was clear. It was the bankruptcy of that quasi-religion. And by the way, among people of my parents' generation, I don't know how many, some of them became disillusioned and then, more liberal, more anti-communist ultimately, but some remained communist believers until the end, despite all that was happening. I'm talking about those who stayed in Poland, not about those who emigrated. Now, before I maybe come to what was happening in Jewish life later, very, very briefly, let me say something more general. Namely, when I think about this now, those who experienced 1968, especially at the universities, or that movement, that rebellion, that agitation, those hopes, and with those links to the world counterculture of the 60s. So all those I feel are my crowd. These are those people who are somehow I feel related to, both those who are Poles in Poland or elsewhere, and those who are somewhere else. I think this is very important, and this somehow has remained with me. Adam Michnik, a leader at that time and until today, in many ways in Poland, said that March 68 was the founding act or source event, if you want, of the dissident movement and the democratic opposition that later developed in the 70s and then merged with the solidarity in some ways. And those people helped really create solidarity and all that anti-communist opposition, for sure, and also some of those who emigrated at the time and became still linked to Poland emotionally, and not only emotionally, some of them were key supporters of especially of Solidarity, of Solidarność movement in 1980, 81, and later. So this is one thing, but the source of the democratic opposition in Poland after that. But I think it is the source of at least two other things, March 68. One, this hasn't been mentioned today, although it was mentioned very extensively at the conference in Warsaw a few days ago, namely that this was also the source of the changes in the communist power elite, the apparatchiks, and so those who were later the elite and were making careers were basically those who, young people, younger than those who had been in top positions at that time, and they were in their 40s mostly, and they made careers, and so this is the source of their careers and their being the new power elite in Poland in the 70s and 80s, including people like Gierek, who of course was a bit older, but he was one of their representatives, and circles connected to Gierek and others. And the third source is what is of interest to me and to us, namely it was the source of a certain renewal of Jewish life after 1968. Of course, 68 made a complete, it was such a blow that the Jewish institutions either disappeared or went into decay, where it was really something that made, it seemed that the Jewish life, Jewish organized life, would disappear, soon. But the fact is that in the late 1970s, 1980s, some of us began to recreate, not institutions, of course, but that consciousness and then some networks of Jewishness and being Jewish. And all of us, who remained, and also those who emigrated, all of us became more Jewish. I mean, some had already been Jewish, okay, but many of us who were not became much more Jewish because of 1968. And to us, again, it took many years, but this process somehow led to networking, and after 1989 in Free Poland, to involvement in the Jewish institutions, which of course were revitalized in the 1990s. I call this whole process de-assimilation. However, this is a de-assimilation, the opposite of assimilation, but without depolonization. It didn't mean that somehow we lost our being Polish. That was not the case. It was remaining Polish in culture and in many other ways, in terms of activities, involvement in Polish life, etc., and then and at the same time becoming more and more Jewish. I think of course, it's a very small group of people. There are very few Jews in Poland, as you know, but it is possible, at least it seemed to us until 2 months ago, that it would be a rather smooth process that would continue, and being Polish and Jewish at the same time would be not really problematic. In the past few weeks, it has been really put to a very serious test. So I don't know if this is the time to talk about the present time, but we know this was already mentioned. In fact, we are very, very concerned, and really the situation we feel is in many ways similar to the 1968, in some ways even worse. It is worse because at that time we could have, we could have hoped, we did hope, I did hope, maybe I was naive, that anti-Semitism is really instigated by the government. Of course, there are many people who are happy because of that, but there are many others who are not happy, but they had no way to show that they were not happy. Today, we have freedom of expression, so it's clear that there are very many who are happy to express anti-Semitism, but also it is important to remember there are others who also express their views. So let me to illustrate that, let me just mention 2 specific events of the very last days, really. One is a statement it's either Facebook or Twitter, I'm not sure, by a rather prominent members of parliament from the ruling party, PiS. Her name is Krystyna Pawłowicz. She's well known for being very outspoken, very paying no attention to any political correctness limitations. And she said, but she is an important person who certainly does express some views and maybe also shapes some views of others. So what she said was, let me translate. The fifth column in Poland, individuals without Polish genes, supported from outside, are more and more arrogant, attack and humiliate the state of their residence. They have crept into the parliament, to the media, and for killing Polishness, they demand higher and higher remuneration. So this is the language that really is exactly the language of the 1968, but even much stronger. Of course, nowadays the language generally is much stronger because, you know, in '68 everything was put in a very...
Doesn't she mean the Ukrainians?
For sure not. For sure not. I mean, she could have made, maybe she meant also others, but certainly everybody in Poland understands this is about the Jews or those who, no, Jews in whatever sense of the term. At the same time, and this is the second event, you know, a week ago, last month, the previous Sunday, there was a gathering, and I think there was even a picture of that gathering at the very beginning, of representatives of 100 Polish NGOs were at the Gdański Dworzec in Warsaw, where they expressed, you know, their solidarity with the Jews. That they said that the government policies, or what the government provoked, or what the government allows to be said about against the Jews, it's not something that we feel, and there are millions of us who are against it, they were saying, and that we want solidarity in truth meaning also the painful truth about World War II and all those things, and we speak as friends to you Jews, to friends, and so it was a very strong and very, I think, important statement by so many organizations, many of them very small, by the way, of course, but still. So there is, as always there has been, there is, you know, there are two faces of Poland, and I don't want really to say that even if the situation is really frightening, that there is only one face of Poland. So to sum up, so March '68 was the most important event of my youth and possibly of my life. Much of what was important to me was initiated at that time. This includes my Jewish involvement, my work in the Polish Museum, my feeling connected to Israel. So after, was it bad or good?